And when you said, there we go.
Oh,
There we are.
Yeah.
That's hot mic.
We are now live.
Yes, we are.
So we are finishing up Hebrews tonight, and it's been a good quarter. The material is ready for the next quarter. I kind of walked in a daze. Is that
Yeah.
okay?
So the question I keep getting asked is which one is which? Sunday morning is the pastoral epistles, which is Timothy and Titus. Wednesday night will be Following the Messiah. Dave Long will be teaching that. Dave, are you going to look for co-teachers as well? Or is your plan to use co-teachers? Is your plan to do this? Okay. Yes. Yeah. Both of us will be using co-teachers, so look for emails soon for that. Following Messiah is going to be, I think there's video clips every lesson, right? Is that correct? And so that's going to be a different kind of study and one that we're looking forward to. So make sure you get those books. So we'll be in 1 Timothy 1 Sunday morning.
Okay. So with that segue, we'll take a look at the end of Hebrews here. And I saw John Dean a minute ago. Do we have a microphone in the room? Okay, great. While you're getting the mic, would you also lead our closing prayer? Thanks. So again, we're in a relatively simple chapter of Hebrews by comparison. As we roll through some of the earlier chapters, it gets has some depth theologically, and this does too as well. But it's not to the is not doing as much going back to the Old Covenant and looking in that to make a point. The Hebrew writer has been making their point all along, and not only is Jesus superior, they've been talking about all the things that we have now. It's and trying to get us to focus on what we have as opposed to what we've lost, and that's the tack that the and I just wanted to roll through these real quick so that you'd get a feel for what throughout the book what he said. We have our, usually it starts off because we have a great high priest, chapter 4, also chapter 8. We have confidence to grasp this hope, chapter 6. A firm and secure anchor, chapter 6. Boldness to enter the heavenly places, chapter 10. Better and lasting possessions, also chapter 10. An interesting one, but still one, because we have this great crowd of witnesses. And then the last one that he talks about, the things that we have currently, is an altar to eat from that no other can. None others can. And that's in chapter 13 here. He just finished one that he points to the future. We will have. Anyone remember what chapter 12 said that we will have? It was something that can't be shaken. A kingdom that cannot be shaken, or a city that cannot be shaken. Either answer is good on that. So he points to one thing that we don't have possession of today, but when you take a look at this list of 7 things that we do have possession of, then everything else that we've given up is something that burns up. Does that make, it makes sense. The things that we gave up are things that are temporary. And so we'll stop there. That's just kind of a review all the way to this point in Hebrews. I'm going to come out of left field, and Terry, what was the thing that jumped out? I mean, what was the thing that in this study of Hebrews 13 that something new or something that you ran across again that you've done in the past just kind of jumped out there for you?
Oh, well, that's okay. I think one of the things that's interesting is for me is the contrast, not just of he introduces the altar, but the connection I don't think I made is this altar outside the camp, and later on, the connection that we may not make to, here's the sacrifice you offer. That you would, there's a little bit of, you're an altar too in this text. And I think I probably connected those in a way that I hadn't previously connected those. And so that's certainly one thing for me, was that connection there of the altar imagery. And a furtherance of, and I've said this when I wasn't teaching in here, furtherance of a, you are the temple in all things the temple. You're the tabernacle, you're the priesthood, you're the altar, you're the instrument. All of those things is fulfilled through us now. And that's part of it being a better covenant. So that probably was different to me than I had hit previously.
Yeah, I'm drawn to this concept of all these things we received is because of grace. A great high priest, and all these things are through the concept of grace. And this is something that one of the commentaries that I used this quarter pointed to. Is now we've reached the point that he's talking about gratitude. How do we show gratitude for all the things that we've received? And of course, the way Paul will reference it is we make ourselves a living sacrifice. We will become cross-shaped individuals. We will become servants of the King, and by doing so, that's how we show gratitude. But here, it's much like a chapter in the book. Well, it's in the first question in the book of Romans. It jumps out to me that there's some similarities the way it's structured. Anyone want to take a pass at question number one? What chapter in Romans does this look like to or sound like to you? Okay, chapter 12. Excellent. That's the one that jumps out to me. He gets into these practical things of what does showing gratitude look like? Gratitude for the things that we've been given, all these amazing things that we've been given, and also the promise of this future thing that we have been promised but not yet given. So how do we react when we are faced with that? And the author says, in gratitude. And by gratitude, he means there's a sacrificial way that we live that points to this. So how can we live out verses 2 and 3 in our lives? I want some practical ideas from the group here. How do we live out those two verses in 21st century American culture? Okay. Okay. All right. Being sympathetic. Okay. And and you'll have to bear with me. I'm just coming off of bronchitis, so I'm really not medicated other than some ibuprofen.
But it's the first time you've not been medicated in a couple days, so we may have withdrawals while you're up there.
So anyhow, I don't wish this on anybody. So I'm not contagious anymore. And I tested for COVID and all that good stuff. So.
Let me.
So anyway, my mind just went totally.
Let me comment on hospitality.
Thank you.
While Joe's trying to find his thoughts. I think we have missed the idea of hospitality in our culture. And let me explain this. I heard, I learned this from a brother in Memphis who was a black brother, and we were in a discussion, a panel with a bunch of young preachers. And he and I were panel discussion. We were the two on the panel talking about racial relations. And the question was, what's the number one thing, what's the best thing I can do to help repair racial division in among brethren? And his answer was, have us in your home. He's like, don't take us out to eat at a restaurant. Bring us into your home. Because bringing us into your home establishes so much more. you bring us into your dwelling place and that you open up your home and that you let us in. It's a measure of trust that he says that he feels from that. And especially in a place like Memphis, by the way, which has tremendous racial issues all the time. And that just hit me that in our culture today, I've heard in my years of preaching, I think now is like 26, I've heard more justifications for not having people in their homes than I've heard of not. And a lot of them are, well, like, I worked hard for everything I have, and I don't want somebody tearing it up, and I've got a nice house. And listen, if you've been blessed with a nice house, God gave you that blessing to use as a blessing for him. Open up your home. There's nothing, and I think that's one of the things here that we've missed. I understand sometimes in a pinch, I go to gospel meetings and we got to be at the building at 7 o'clock and somebody gets off at 5 and it's hard to, and we go out to eat, and that's not what I'm talking about. But when you can, nothing shows and builds fellowship more than bringing somebody into the place you live. It's way different than taking them to La Mesa. Okay? And by the way, if you're not a good cook, just go buy La Mesa and put it in serving dishes and act like you are. But coming into your home is a big deal. So I just want to emphasize that from that standpoint, that hospitality that makes a huge difference to people and builds connections that you can't build at a restaurant. Sitting in your living room, you can build a deeper connection than you can in a restaurant. It's just how it is.
Yeah, agreed. When
Charlie had his hand up, by the way, so I know Charlie's not bashful. If we can get a mic. Listen, with the mics, if you're willing to speak on a mic, we long periods of dead silence is, we have people that are watching, so we're trying to, if you don't want to speak in a mic, just wave people off and speak anyway.
We were talking last night about a cultural thing that has happened, and it really hadn't dawned on me, and it goes right to what you're talking about going into homes and having people into your homes. Now, in the old days, if you wanted to watch a movie that was coming on, you'd say, come over to my house and we'll watch the movie, just as an example. Now they don't have to do that. Now they can say, oh, I'm going to look at it next Friday. You couldn't do that 50 years ago, or even less than that. So I think our whole life is less involved in community and in family and in friends and neighbors than it's ever been before, because of the quickness and it's not personal enough, but the phones and the messages and all the rest of that. And it just becomes a habit. And certainly that's not what we ought to do as Christians. And it's one of those kind of things that I believe the basic society is putting that kind of pressure on you.
Charlie's, we could spend a whole seminar on how to do that effectively in terms of those type of things. If we're going to be countercultural, and by countercultural I mean counter world, then we're gonna have to get off our devices and see people face to face, and that's just, if it was better in the 21st century than God would have created Apple 2,000 years ago or 4,000 years ago. It's just that's not the way you make impact. And I know we've got some comments coming, but I was going to amplify what Terry said. When we were working in the downtown work, having people into your home was part of the process, and part of developing the kind of relationships where one is you got to understand what the gospel meant to them, or what salvation meant to them, because you talked about things like that, and you talked about the difficulties and the trials that were in people's lives, and it made an impact. People would say, I cannot believe I've not been invited to somebody's house in 20 years, that kind of thing. And they couldn't believe they were being invited into other people's houses just because we were now brothers and sisters in the Lord. And Who has the?
Brandon.
Brandon.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I think it goes even deeper than that. I mean, you know, in the Bible, we're instructed to use our talents to help our brothers, to help other people. And where it says, let brotherly love continue. You know, who's my brother? Well, you know, we've seen what Jesus said about that. But I think you should use everything you have to show kindness to other people. If God's given you the talent to do something and you can help somebody, whether it's, and I do agree with what Joe said about personal connection, you know, and, you know, telling somebody I won't pray for you, well, that's all well and good, but if you hold their hand and actually pray with them, man, that's a whole lot more. If somebody's, you know, needs something and you have the ability to fix it or to help them with it, man, that really makes an impact. You know, if you've got an elderly neighbor that, you know, needs your help, go help them. You know, if you've got somebody that lives down the road from you that needs help with something and you can do it, go do it. It's just that simple. And I mean, that's what it means to me. And, you know, I mean, that's what hospitality is. And that's what it always has been, is using your gifts, using your abilities. And I mean, in Acts, what did the Christians do? They divided their livelihoods amongst each other. Well, we'd have a, you know, come apart if we said we was going to divide our livelihoods. But I mean, that's what this is all about, is sharing what you have, sharing what you are. So,
One of the interesting things, real quick, we need to move on, I know, but hospitality specifically in the Bible is almost always a table event. It's always eating. When he talks about those who entertained angels unaware, he's referencing Abraham who fixed food. I remember growing up, my mom would fix food, and we had no idea who was coming over. The table was set, and she said, clean the room, which was translation for shove everything under your bed and in your closet so nobody can see. And we lived in a college town, and there were always people, and you never knew who was coming over. You just knew that there were X number of seats set, and they would figure that out at church. That's a dying art. We don't do that anymore. And that's closer to what this is talking about, by the way. That's closer to the image that's here. Now, I know we want to talk about those in prison.
Well, I mean, that's,
Which one?
What's the theology about the angels?
Well, it just refers to like the situation with Abraham, where Abraham, these strangers show up and Abraham feeds them, and then they turn out to be angels.
yeah.
That they don't identify themselves as angels. That's the clearest representation. But in fact, in that picture, he's been out in the field all day. They show up, and he gets bread and cooks them a meal and feeds it to them on the stump, if I remember correctly, and they end up being angels.
Yeah.
And that's the picture that's drawn there, is you entertain strangers because they could be angels.
I think he's got Lot in.
Lot did too.
Yeah.
Lot didn't do as good a job as entertaining as Abraham.
Well, we
He
won't.
saved them, but anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We won't talk about righteous Lot like
Yeah.
like Peter does.
Yeah.
But so
Yeah.
anyhow, moving along, I you know, to amplify what Terry said, I think it's you have to go to the Smithsonian to see that anymore, Terry. It's more
That's
than
a
a
dead
dying
art.
art. It's a dead.
Yeah, something we need to revive,
Yeah.
truthfully. We need to do a better job of that.
So prison, he's specifically referencing those other Christians who've been put in prison. He's not talking about, and he's not precluding a prison ministry or something like that. He's just saying, just make sure, as part of hospitality, as part of brotherly, as part of all that, make sure that when you have brothers and sisters who are in prison, that you take care of them. And nothing, people listen to the gospel after they've seen the gospel more readily than listen to the gospel before they've ever seen the gospel lived out. Does that, and hopefully I'm making sense, and
I think there's also a slight difference today. In most cases, our brethren that end up in prison in our country probably deserve to be in prison because they've done a criminal act that's not faith, because of the freedoms we have. And this is about those who are imprisoned for their faith. But I will tell you, I've had multiple friends that I grew up with from church and from a religious background who have ended up in prison, and they are all but deserted by our brethren because they deserve to be there. And I have reached out in 3 different cases to those individuals and encouraged them and written them, and it's been probably more rewarding for me than it has been for them. So I do think there's a modern day application here in those cases, that even your brother who deserves to be there, you still need to remember, because his soul's at stake.
Right.
And I think that's the modern day application.
I think so. And we don't have a lot of that, thankfully, right now. But here's one that's real world, and we can do it. We can start today. We can pray for those who are imprisoned in the Middle East,
Right.
and in the Far East, and
China.
Christian. That's what I meant by the Christians who are incarcerated and are being mistreated by the local governments, and that's going on. And we don't have to know exactly where, but let's make that part of who we are. Lift up our prayers for that. Well, Terry just had a lesson on keeping the marriage bed honorable. I don't think
Let's skip that. Right?
we can skip that and move along. Here's how do we keep ourselves free from the love of money? We live in a very prosperous nation currently, and so how do we keep ourselves free from the love of contentment? All right, contentment is a great answer. Okay. Okay. Right. Okay. So Jonathan amplified contentment by saying hospitality. We take what we have and we share it, and that points to that we're not in love with gathering wealth. And one of the things that this particular author that I've been reading said is we show gratitude, and by that, when God blesses us, then we realize, the instant gratitude steps in and we start thanking the Lord for what He's done for us, it makes it to the point that we see it as a gift. We see it as part of His blessings on us, and then that points us in the other. It starts with contentment to do something to say, oh, I didn't. Most of us. I say most of us. Some of us grew up thinking, "Hey, I did this because I went to this school, or I'm this smart, or I'm this strong, or I'm this attractive, or I'm this whatever," and we pile all the credit on us. We do it secretly. We don't, because we look down at others who don't have the same thing. We go, well, they just didn't apply themselves. They weren't as diligent, or the list goes on. No, it's the Lord's blessings, and if you've got a gift of you had the brains to be a brain surgeon, God gave you that gift. And it didn't start with you. It came from Him.
I'll also bring up Hebrews 10:34, when it talked about that you had compassion on those in prison and joyfully accepting the plundering of your property, since you knew that you yourselves had a better possession. 1 Timothy 6, when we get there in our pastoral epistle study, it talks about the love of money. What it tells the rich to do is to build up a treasure in heaven. And both of those concepts are the same. Part of contentment is knowing that this is temporary, and the treasure you have to come is eternal. That also ties back to Hebrews 12 and Hebrews 11 and so many other things that he said. That part of this is just looking forward, and that this doesn't matter. Your riches here don't matter.
So, Jesus being unchanging in his character, how does that encourage us in our walk? And I'm referring to the passage where he's the same today, yesterday, and forever. He's always kept his promises. He's the same creator that they spoke in Genesis 1, let us make humankind in our image. And there's an unchanging nature about God that is comforting, because we can go into a job and someone make us a promise, like you do this job for X number of years, and then we're going to give you this much bigger job, and people will make promises, and they will change, and they will change the terms. They will forget any promises. God's not like that. So when he's talking about all these things that are in the future, God's the same forever. And when he listened to Noah, and he listened to Moses, and he listened to Abraham, he's the same God today. And he wants to have that kind of Moses relationship, Abraham relationship, where we trust him implicitly for all that he's promised.
I love the way N.T. Wright said that you read the tragic stories of the newspaper, they always connect back to either sex, power, money, or suffering. But when you have your faith rooted in Jesus and who he is, none of those things will blow you off track and into the newspapers. And I love the way he said that. Mm-hmm. That's kind of the idea of this what we're seeing and being addressed are, especially the things like marriage and sex and money. Those are common issues in this culture. And so he's addressing those things, but coming back to, as long as you're rooted in Jesus, you'll be fine.
Yeah. And you mean the first century culture. And
right.
It's the same, yeah.
It's the same today, but that culture specifically.
Yeah, yeah. So, yeah, you don't pick, well, there is no such thing as a paper anymore. And Charlie could tell us for days about all the intricacies of that. But you don't make the paper in 1940. That's before you, Charlie. But in 1965, you didn't make the Birmingham News because, Joe and Karen Smith have been together, married for 30 years. No, you make the paper when you do one of these things that he's talking about. And so, it's on social media now. It's on everywhere you turn. You see all these disruptions and these violations of God's plan, and that's what makes the news. And it continues to make news. And I love that whole section from N.T. Wright as well, is that, and I'm going to add to his thoughts, is when our vision is the next life, then we're not going to get caught up in the things about power and money and sex and those, because those things don't matter. They don't have the same allure when we look at things the way God sees them. Well, verses, and I should apologize right off the get-go. There's a typo, my typo on the next page. If you could not answer number 1 under the benedictions because of me, I sent you to the wrong place. I should have sent you to Colossians, and I sent you to...
Struggle forever with that.
Yeah, so so if you've got an answer for Philippians, I'd love to hear it.
Yeah, because I didn't have one. I sat there for 30 minutes.
Oh, dear. Well, I'm sorry of all the valuable time of the saints that I've wasted this week. But the verses 9 through 13 refer back to what event that happens in the Old Testament. The high priest, and it's the sin offering that takes place. And if we remember the structure behind that, there were parts of it, the blood goes on the horns of the altar, and the rest of the blood gets dumped at the base of the altar. There's parts of the internal parts that go on the altar there inside the temple area. and they get burned up, and I forget the parts, but entrails, kidneys, things like that. But then they take the skin and the meat and what's left in the colon tract, and they take it outside the camp, and they burn it up outside the camp. And that's what he's referencing in this sin offering.
It's on the Day of Atonement.
Yeah, the Day of Atonement.
And goes back to Leviticus 16, where
So,
the instructions are.
yeah, and so we're to go outside the camp with the Savior and be part of, be the sacrifice. And he's showing us the ways that we can sacrifice here.
There's a lot of layers to this imagery, Day of Atonement, and everything else. One of them is that Jesus was also sacrificed outside of the city. And I think that's very important. You also have this idea in verse 9 of those who live by food, and verse 10, those who serve the tent. And I think part of this is there's starting to be as he closes out this book, this makes me feel like part of the point of Hebrews is distance yourself from Jerusalem because of what is coming. There's a little bit of that as well, outside the gate, outside the city, outside the tent. There's a little bit of connection. A lot of commentators will point to this: the temple's about to be destroyed. There's civil unrest in Jerusalem, and it's not a safe place for Christians in Jerusalem at this point either, because of all of that. So there's a lot of layers, I think, to this imagery, starting at its most surface level of what happens on the Day of Atonement and Jesus' connection, but also the separating yourself from Judaism as a whole.
Yeah.
And he's been building towards that. So if you think about that, everything's better. And now we're going to go outside the gate and outside the camp and away from the tent and away from the priesthood. It's an interesting kind of thing that's being said there too.
Yeah, and the difficult thing in this section is don't be led away by diverse and strange teachings. And he just hasn't referred to Old Covenant in language like that. And it's I wrestle with that because I do think he's talking about the things that Terry just talked about. But there's this other thing that's going on that happened at a later date, is that so many faith cultures do have these food items as part of their worship, and some the Eastern Orthodox churches, for instance, have it on every Wednesday and Friday. Certain things can't be eaten. I had a group of labs I used to call on that the person in charge was Russian Orthodox, and they kept popping up all the time. I'd offer to take them to lunch and say, well, where are we going? And I'd say, such, well, I can't eat there because it's got that. And I said, well, you pick it because you know what you can't eat today. But it was always something like that. And we'd talk about his religion, and there was more emphasis on that piece of it than there was on fidelity in marriage and certainly things like drunkenness and things like that. That was more acceptable. But eating shellfish on the wrong day was he couldn't do it. He couldn't bring himself to do it. So I'm not saying that this is it's being referred to here, but we humans have this tendency of heading down a trail, and we can generate things like that. And there's a lot of faith groups that have that.
Grew up, my dad worked for a lab, speaking of labs, owned by two brothers that were Seventh-day Adventists. And they'd go out to eat. One would eat shellfish and one would not, even though they were brothers and they went to the same place. But one is far more fundamental than the other one. But
Yeah.
they also follow the dietary restrictions.
Of the
Yeah.
Hebrews, yeah.
Yeah.
So, okay, what is the fruit of our lips? Prayers, okay. In this context, what does he call the fruit of our lips? Or in this verse here, praising his name. And I don't think he's not referencing song here. I think that should be more a part of our daily conversation, where we're praising his name, and not an empty way, but in a way that it becomes natural for us, because we recognize he's due all the praise that we can that we can possibly give him.
Chris?
Chris? Yeah.
I actually take this to be just worship. I take it to probably be maybe a little broader than that. It could be prayers, it could be thanksgiving, it could be songs, it could be the way you talk to people. But the ultimate thing is, and I think this gets back to what I said earlier about you're the altar of praise. And I think there's just a fulfillment of this they're supposed to get, that you offer praise and you're different. And I think it expands as much as you can do with your mouth in any way. But that's just me personally.
So, this chapter has 4 actions listed regarding elders. 2 in each direction, kind of is the way that runs. What are the actions? What are the actions toward the shepherds that are expected, according to the Hebrew writer? Okay, and then what are the actions and responsibilities of the shepherds? Okay, so the first one is intimidating enough. I'll tell you that. The second one, if you haven't considered that carefully, then you're sleepwalking. You will give an account for what you.
I actually got 4 things we're supposed to do, the elders, and that begins in verse 7, which is remember, and then obey in verse 17, pray in verse 18, and greet in verse 24.
Yeah.
And I found that interesting how extensive it is, all the things that you're supposed to offer towards your leadership. There's a lot of recognition that goes into that. I just think that's valuable to kind of consider. From a shepherd standpoint, those 2 things are overwhelming enough. You don't need 4. But I think from the sheet, there's really 4 things here that we're supposed to offer in 3 different really sections. I do think it's interesting, by the way, that we don't always connect verse 18 to verse 17, and we should in the context. And that may get into who's writing this and some of those questions, but the pray for us in verse 17 does seem to be that the writer is identifying himself somewhat with the leadership that they're to pray for and to obey and submit to, which is fairly interesting as well. Mm-hmm. So some translations have a break there, and some put those in a paragraph together, and it's pretty interesting to see that.
Yeah. Still doesn't answer. I mean, Clement was a shepherd there.
There's no way to answer.
There's no way to know.
We get to verse 20 and 21, it's going to get even more confusing. So.
Yeah. So, and if you have any interest at all, there's some verbiage after this lesson. But
I feel like being just contrarian, saying it's Priscilla, just to.
Yeah. Okay. Be contrary.
Yeah.
That would certainly make
yeah.
That would make 17 and 18 interesting.
It would be. Yes, that's a joke, folks.
Okay.
By the way.
So we'll skip that. We're going to spend just a little bit of time on the concept of benediction here. This book offers a benediction. It's interesting that excuse me, didn't mean to do that to the mic. There's at least 3 other times in Scripture that the writer will end the book with a benediction. And what I found in each time is there's an interesting phrase that's always or interesting concept in every benediction. And I think Lori has stumbled across this as well. She had a big smile on her face. It's the word peace. And first off, benediction, just in simple terms, is offering a blessing, and that's all that means. And I think it would be completely appropriate for us to have a corporate benediction to end service. We do sing a benediction song, and now it's escaped me, Terry.
God bless you. Go with God. Is
Yeah, that's the one I was thinking of. And then there's also. But anyhow, the ones that I've uncovered in the New Testament for as far as benedictions, Galatians 6, 1 Thessalonians 5, 2 Thessalonians 3, and then, of course, Hebrews that we're in right now. And he says, now may the God of peace, who brought again from the dead our Lord Jesus, the great shepherd of the sheep, by the blood of his eternal covenant. And so he starts off with this phrase, but the benediction is for the listener or for the reader here, or for the congregation that this is being read to. And here's the benediction that goes on, because he's appealed to the God of peace for this. He says, to equip you with every good thing that you may do his will, working in us that which is pleasing in his sight through Jesus Christ, and then who gets the glory forever and ever. And so the interesting thing about these benedictions is they offer God's peace, but it's God's peace so that his word might go forth, or that you may be equipped to do good works, or you may be equipped to shine him this week. And that's the purpose behind the benediction. I love the concept, and just throwing that out.
The language here is interesting because it's a lot of times you have offering the peace of God. This is not offering the peace of God, but this is calling upon the God of peace, or the God who grants peace. And so it's more of an identifier of God, not that peace is drawn out of it, but it's more of a, may the God who gives you peace do this for you in that process. And I think that's one of the things that's really interesting. The reason why 20 and 21 are so interesting is because that's probably the most solid thing that makes you think Paul wrote Hebrews. Because it is just compact Pauline language. Like these two verses are the most like Paul's writing out of all 13 chapters.
Yeah.
And the only time we see anything like this is written by Paul. And so that's one of the things, and some of these phrases look like they're just copied from Paul directly, which is one of the more interesting things. So a lot of the reason why Paul gets some credit is because of these two verses. And that's just one thing to keep in mind.
But it would be the one book that doesn't have grace and peace in the salutation, and there is no salutation. And there's a number of reasons why Paul is almost not even on the radar anymore as far as having been the writer of this. There's a number of reasons behind it, including words that get used uniquely and things of that. There are just so many.
I think if it wasn't for these two verses, we wouldn't even consider it, to be truthful.
Yeah, and a lot of...
Yeah, some form of that. Yep. That's one of the reasons I lean towards it being somebody that didn't write anything else. I mean, I think that's probably the most logical thing. And might even be, just to be honest, I've not talked about this, but might even be somebody because of its time period that is borrowing from Paul and other people in their writing. But there's some mirroring going on here.
Due to the Timothy language and those from Italy is probably a reference to talking about those from Rome, but it's, I mean, either way, it's just saying that Paul would have had a great influence on whoever the writer of this book is, and to copy a little bit of Paul here to close it out would certainly not be a negative. It would be a sign of admiration and thankfulness to all that you've done. But think about that. We do. There's another thing that can be done to close out worship, and we normally do a closing prayer, which is fine. But there's you can do what's called a doxology, which is just a song to the Lord, and it's intended to close the worship as well. And that's Jude is the only one that I know of off the top of my head that does a doxology to end its book. But there's just interesting concepts. 1 minute. There we go again. So if you were to pick one topic that's covered in Hebrews that jumps out, that looks most like exhortation to you, what would if you just heard this in a sermon, it takes 40 minutes to read it, incidentally. So 40-minute sermon's not completely outside of the realm of possibility.
No, but y'all think it's forever.
What would you get from this sermon? What would be the thing that would you if you're talking about it over lunch at the, what's that, La Mesa?
La Mesas, yeah.
Whatever Mexican restaurant.
The table, that's what it means.
Oh,
The table, yeah,
So,
Church of Christ, but
yeah.
so what would you say, what was the preacher's message about when you finished the book? And all answers are good here.
I think it's about a new covenant.
All right. Eric gets new covenant. All right. Righteous living. All right. Good.
Run the race before you with endurance. I think chapter 12 is, as a preacher looking at this, it looks like all that stuff is, to me, is leading up to chapter 12. This is better, everything's better. Have faith, cast off your weight, and run the race. And all these people are in the crowd. I wasn't here last week, but there's a friend of mine wrote a book where he paints the picture of running into the Coliseum for the finish line and the stands being filled with all those people of Hebrews 11 that you read about in the Old Testament cheering you on. That picture's always stuck in my mind as a beautiful picture.
Any others? Brother Dean, would you close us in prayer?
Our Father, we come to you in prayer at the close of this class. As a group of your people, we desire to live honorably, God, as we have read tonight. And that's something that we need to look at each and every day and look to you each and every day, God. And we pray to you that you would help us strive to live honorably and righteous before you, God, and to see the people around us, whether it be an elder in our life or whether it be a stranger prisoner, that we could find a way to show kindness and love to both of those types of individuals in a way that we would see them as you would see them, a soul and someone that you love deeply. Help us see that each and every day, that's what you would have us to do. And God, when we see the things around us, the blessings you give us, help us be content with that. Help us see all the things that we have, whether it be a lot or whether it be a little, as temporary gifts of this life, as things you have given us, and as things that really don't matter, God. It's easy to say that, God, but sometimes it's just tougher to do as we have grown up in this world full of stuff. So, God, once again, we pray to you to help us with that in our life, in our walk with you, and that we would use the things that we have learned in this class as ways to grow closer to you, God. And as we live and come across doubts in our lives, doubts in our faith, and God, even sometimes doubts in you, help us know and realize that you have answered a lot of those things in this book, Hebrews. And we're thankful for it. We're thankful for the time to look at it and the men who have helped lead the studies this quarter for us. Again, God, thank you for your word, and help us absorb it more and more each and every day. In Jesus' name, amen.
No,